What's up, guys? This is RCA Apologist coming at you with another video. I'm going to be doing a little bit of waiting before we begin to the main portion of this matter. So regarding why I've been making these again, been reading this particular work in my spare time lately, and with what the content is found in it, the main thing that I have found is there are some, I believe, valuable things to consider regarding the terminologies that are used, as well as the points argued by Clark. Now, again, like I mentioned in the last one I've done on this, I do not agree with Clark on everything. Definitely disagree in terms of how the argumentation is supposed to go and everything like that. There was a big whole, split between Vantel and Clark back in the day regarding the matter. What's up, Metal Minister? I see you in the chat. So, regarding the matter, we're covering the one particular section, which is the chapter on puppets, or the section on puppets in the short booklet, in God and Evil, The Problem Solved by Gordon H. Clark. And so what we're essentially just going to do here is go over one particular point raised in a couple of paragraphs in the start of the section. This will be on page 29 for those who end up getting the copy. By the way, if you do want a copy of this, it is on the Trinity Foundation for $5.95 for just this booklet. That being said, going over what is stated here, he points out in quoting and referring to a specific author by the name of Professor Hackett, Stuart C. Hackett, where basically he charges, according to what is written in the book, quote, Professor Stuart C. Hackett charges the Calvinistic determinism reduces men to mere puppets. And as he points to what his point ultimately becomes, Hackett, quote, Hackett's, quote, major point, however, is that Calvinism is supposed to reduce men to puppets. So his response follows as such. Such an objection could arise only upon an ignorance of Puritan writings. Perhaps the objector has seen a chapter in the Westminster Confession on free will, or he may have read in the Shorter Catechism that our first parents were left to the freedom of their own wills. Then, without reading the literature of that day, he assumes that official Calvinism is more moderate than the view defended here, and that a denial of free will is hyper-Calvinism. A creed, however, is not a detailed philosophical treatise, and its phrases must be understood in the sense in which the authors meant them. If this meaning is not clear from the creedal context itself, it must be sought in the literature. So his point that he goes into here is that there's the language that is utilized in the Westminster Confession and that of the Catechism, shorter and larger at this point, but that with the language utilized there, we must not assume that they speak in the 21st century kind of context of philosophy, and that they actually speak in a different term depending on, of course, the context and the culture, of which he says the best way to get that explanation of what they meant is to go to the literature of the time in which they are expounding and explaining these things, hence the Puritan literature. Now, the Westminster Confession indeed speaks of the natural liberty of man's will. The first paragraph of chapter 9 is, God has endued the will of man with that natural liberty that is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined to be good or evil. So we see there from the first paragraph of chapter 9 of the Westminster Confession, God has given, granted, established the will of man that natural liberty is neither... Sorry about that, little charging thing went up. It says that God has endued, given, granted the will of man with the natural liberty that is neither forced nor by any absolute necessity of nature determined to be good or evil. Then the next part of the phrases says, quote, these phrases could seem to be accommodations to the theory of free will, but they can seem so only because the meaning of the phrase, absolute necessity of nature, has been mistaken. The Reformation Principles, a part of the standards of the Reformed Presbyterian Church, makes a clearer statement when it condemns in error the view that man, quote, is necessarily impelled to choose or act as an unconscious machine. Even the early 17th century phrases must have seemed unambiguous when they were written, for they were chosen against the background of a century of discussion. They are certainly to be taken in a sense consistent with the Confession's chapter on the divine decree. Here again, the Reformation principles is quite clear, for the immediately following error denounced is, quote, that he can will or act independently of the purpose or the providence of God. If the meaning of these phrases has been forgotten by some present-day writers, hence trying to reestablish and quote these, the remedy lies in reading the discussion of the 17th and 18th century. So, this is particularly the paragraphs here. If you want to read more of it, there's parts of it where he's essentially then pointing out to Gill, one of the people that is definitely relevant to the discussion in light of the context of the period and the further discussion of it, as well as his interaction then with the issues of Stoicism and the likes. But that is the one thing to consider, is that usually when people refer to the term free will, we have to be careful by what we mean and what we define to be that notion, because as like mentioned before when I made the video on the Trinity and the definition of persons, there's persons, but persons, even during the time that it was used, had so many different meanings that it was hard to figure out what was being said. Likewise, how even within the notion of Clarke and Van Til would use the term persons to different extents, where he would say God is triune, three persons, but then he would also say God, the absolute being, is one person, but he's not trying to deny Trinitarianism by any means. And then likewise, in a similar sense, Clarke, in his Problem of Evil booklet, manages to show a distinction between different definitions of free will, and mentions that seems to be the main problem when engaging into the discussion today, is that you are going to have people who define free will differently than other people, and that's the point. We need to find out what the actual definition we are utilizing and applying. So, that being said, with what is there, we need to consider the fact that, number one, with the notion of free will, that it does apply the ability to make choices, because as is even seen in the Reformation principles and the early statements of the Presbyterian Church at that time for Clarke and Van Til, is that ultimately they knew that to say that you are completely impelled and forced and being unconscious in a sense, like a machine or a puppet, depending on how the objection goes, is heresy according to the Reformed Church. So when you have in the Reformation principles, and then this fits into the context of the Westminster Confession, what it says, especially when you look into the section on free will, then it refutes not just simply the notion of what the non-Calvinist tries to put out there, but also it points out that they need to be a little more careful in how they try to raise their objections, because to simply suggest that it reduces people to mere puppets, such as the non-Calvinist and Stuart C. Hackett had pointed out, then it ultimately shows an unfamiliarity with the position and thus reduces it into a straw man that cannot be consistently accounted for unless further elaborating on the sources itself of an internal critique, which I don't think the non-Calvinists will be able to bring to the table. With that being said, that's all I'm going to go over for the moment with this booklet. So that's God and Evil, the problem solved. Again, I don't agree with the lex hex, or ex lex, as it says here, defense that he proposes that we should take on it, but if you do want it, then take a look at the arguments yourself. Trinity Foundation, $5.95, order it online. But that being said, this has been RC Apologist, and take care.